Okay, so welcome to the first Antelope Coalition meeting. We forgot that, really. So great day today with all the announcements. Now this is the Antelope Coalition bi-weekly meeting. So welcome everybody. I prepared something. Hold on. Where is it? I explicitly found this, and I don't know if Douglas' favorite Dick is here, which is there, but this is what we are now.
It looks like it is. Isn't that it? Second row? Second from the right?
I don't know.
Oh, Royal Antelope.
The Royal.
The Royal Antelope.
Good. So
I actually searched for Dick. I searched for the species list, and all the ones I found were unacceptable because none of them had our favorite cute little tiny one, the Dick. I couldn't find one that had it. It was kind of bizarre because I know it's true.
Yeah. So, but new name, many people excited, and it's a great start for our future. So awesome, we're here. So back to business. We wanted to talk about the IBC faster finality vote and contract. We did have some initial discussions about how we would vote on this today and how we would go forward, because there are basically 3 signers required for a contract. So even if we vote for doing this, it is more like stating the intent to sign the contract and move forward with this. So EOS Eve just put out that he would generally confirm the intent to sign the contract as long as it is sure that the IP rights and license are secured for any code base that's being produced and merged. So you want to kind of outline this a little more?
Yeah, essentially, as I was saying, I just want to ensure that in any of the contracts that we hand out, because the functions that we are working on within the coalition are really at the highest level, because our priorities are really protocol level functions, that any code that gets merged does not bring in with it any potential liabilities of having IP issues or usage issues. So that, and that applies to faster finality, SDKs, IBC, whereby anything that we put in, once it's in, it belongs to everybody. And everybody meaning outside of the coalition as well. Or it is free to use, sorry, it does not belong to everybody. It's free to use by anybody.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's been the assumption or understanding for all of us, but it's really good to have that directly addressed. So,
and for the record, Darren and I discussed, and we're in agreement. We would essentially suggest each milestone gets reviewed, approved, paid, open sourced, and like basically on open source on their MIT license. So essentially, anything that gets produced is automatically, like made available under MIT and can be merged with the code base if the developers decide to do so.
Yeah, so there's nothing contentious here. I just wanted to affirm that essentially because we never really talked about that.
Yes. Okay. And this is also already part of the contract, or is that part being amended?
We will amend it, but it's a very minor amendment.
Okay, awesome. Then we have that confirmed.
And with that in mind, then
yes.
yes, EOS will sign and we agree and we vote or we support very much so and can't wait for the work to start the faster finality and IBC priorities.
Excellent. Heading this to Jesse or TELOS.
Yeah, yes, you put a yes there.
Any caveats or any restrictions here?
I wouldn't. Sorry.
We need to confirm the amount of TELOS and when it's to be delivered. I know it was intended to be delivered at the start of the contract.
That is already in the document that was sent. So the exact amount of TELOS tokens has already been determined.
Yes,
as well as the time.
I mean more about when it's supposed to be delivered, because we may need to do.
Yeah,
we need to source those funds. Is it at the start of the agreement or at? I know
it is to be delivered at the start of the agreement to a contract, but to a smart contract. But essentially, it's not payable until.
Right, it's locked up till the end, but delivered at the start. Okay,
correct.
I'll go read through and see the number and make sure we figure out where that's going to flow from. So when is that? Do we have a date then, or is it like the day that we execute this that we would send them over, or send
within
them
a reasonable time after having signed the contract?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think that you sign the contract and then there's a 5-second delay if the funds need to be sent. I think there's reasonable.
Within a day.
You've signed the contract, now you're legally liable. Please send over the funds.
No, I think it would be reasonable, like for like 30 days or whatever.
30 days. Okay. I just want to know, what we gotta shell game we gotta play to get that amount into a contract. So,
Kirsten, I would remove UX abstain because it's not really UX can't abstain. I mean, they're not on the contract. It's true. Their contract.
They're contract partners, so they cannot abstain. You're obviously right. Okay. Needs to verify what. And have not been able to attend the meeting. So generally we have quorum as much as we can, with the restrictions that obviously WAX needs to sign the contract anyway. So to make it happen. Okay. But that's generally great news then.
It's awesome news, yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess then Darren, Guillaume, you guys are going to send kind of a modified version of the final version that we just got the other day.
Yeah. The one that will basically get rid of the license and essentially say that when milestones are completed, accepted and paid for, we open source under MIT license.
And maybe in there, I saw that you had changed everything from EOS Coalition to EOSIO Coalition. May as well then change again to Antelope Coalition. That's a small change. I think that was throughout. Otherwise, I believe that you've addressed all of the issues, well, not issues, items that I had brought up, and I don't think we got anybody else with any particular.
No, I brought up a number of items, and they've also all been addressed.
Great. So then I think that will be the final version. Then once that's that the final change is made.
Yeah, I'm fine. If you're asking me, I'm fine with that, but I would like it to go to Antelope.
Yes, of course. Yeah,
of course.
Yeah. And good job, Darren and team on that. It was very well written, very clear, and it captured everything that I was looking for, other than those few small things. Otherwise, it was very in the way that you laid out the Schedule 3 milestones and the payment, exactly what I was thinking of. That makes it very easy to understand. So good job on that.
Excellent. Then we can move over to Wallet SDK voting and approval. So as we discussed this long time, I think there are no general content questions and technical questions anymore. You had the negotiation, the revised version of the proposal has been submitted by Aaron. Has everybody had a chance to read through that and agrees to that? I guess so. So then I would like to bring this up for vote to move forward. So asking EOS, Eve.
I vote in favor of starting this,
So that's
of assigning this contract. Yes, I vote resounding yes.
Excellent.
Resounding, very resounding yes.
Jesse?
Yes.
Yom?
Yes.
Excellent. So Wax, we will reconfirm with Lucas in Telegram chat, but we reached quorum, so we will continue, and would like to discuss with or have the final approval from Wax. But I don't personally think he would have any objections because the signs and comments that he made in previous meetings and regarding this documentation and proposal was always positive. So I assume he will vote yes, but I will verify with him after the meeting.
And for clarification as well, I do believe that Wax would vote yes on this, but should we be in a position where not all chains agree, we do not need, under current governance mechanisms, we do not need unanimity in order to proceed. As much as that's nice, and it's pretty much been the case every time, just to put that out there for those listening, that is not required.
Yes, we have quorum based on the 3 chains voting yes, so we will continue with the developments and are happy that Aaron, finally, you can start doing the things that you've been working on for so long. So that's great. Everybody's anticipating that and waiting for you to start and deliver those things.
I know we're excited to get started, so that'll be awesome. Looking forward to working with you guys on the branding and the ideas and making sure that expectations are met throughout this process. It's going to be a couple months, like it'll be well into next year by the time we're done talking about this. And then I'm sure we'll have plenty of other ideas of things that need to be added in.
Did you say more branding?
Potentially.
More names?
More names.
Aaron, I have just a question on that because,
Sure.
As you know, I mean, you and I have been chatting tech stuff about using the EOSIO core library more in the Explorer. So, what just now that this is effectively approved, how soon before you think, and it touches on, I guess, branding, is there a name decision that has to happen before what you have in your library in its current form could potentially become, Antelope JS or whatever? Like, how soon before, like, we could start, importing and using it under a new name, I guess would be the question.
I'm not entirely sure I have a timeline on that. That one repository that already exists, that's kind of the core of this project. We do plan on putting that into the Antelope repository. What that's called, however, I'm not sure it'll be renamed immediately. I think keeping it in its current namespace as opposed to changing it multiple times is probably a good thing. The suite itself may have a name. I forget what one of the Ethereum ones is, but one of the other ones is Hard Hat. And then they kind of have subcomponents of that. I imagine this will be similar to that, where like the suite itself has kind of a bigger name, and then the subcomponents may have individual names. sort of like the releases, Leap, for example. So whether or not we can do that early with EOSIO Core, what's currently being called, getting a name before everything else. I'm not sure that rename makes sense to happen sooner than the larger naming process. If that made sense.
Yeah, I was just curious how soon we can start using the new one, and then only have to deal with version upgrades as opposed to like renaming of it.
Yeah, and on the technical side, it'll just be renaming where those things are imported from. I think all of the individual components themselves will be rather generic names. Like the API client is still going to be an API client. It's not going to be like a something JS client. The library name may change though, and the namespace.
Okay. So libraries and namespace, good keyword. We had the status of GitHub migration or migration and scenario where Jeff and Adam had been preparing project plans and checklists for the actual tasks. So may I ask Jeff, what is the status of the activities? Or Ted, maybe in combination, not sure who is actually doing this.
For the, excuse me, the cutover?
Yeah.
And so, yes, we did have a project plan. It's technically still open. We worked with all of our teams to hit this week's objectives. There are still follow-up marketing and communication items on the list that are marked with dates in the future. Not really beyond that, what specifically are you asking?
Well, question is, maybe you want to share the project plan and we can look at that and see which items have been already done and which are pending. So that makes sense.
I mean, it's mostly an ENF plan. So GitHub has been migrated. It's not probably at the level you might want to see deeper into GitHub. Mostly ARG is doing that. And so, the repos are done for the most part. You've got the build was given to Matthew Darwin. It is running on Jungle right now. The Leap 3.1 RC4 build is live and running off of the new repos. ARG is now putting all of the coalition GitHub accounts back in. We've changed some of the permissioning, et cetera. So there's a few other older repos that will come across more slowly, but for the most part, it is done. We're straddling the issues, meaning the issues that live in the old EOS Network Foundation repos. We're slowly working to close those out. New issues will be created in the Antelope repos. And eventually, when we get down to just a handful of open issues that live in the EOS Network Foundation, we'll hand create those over in the Antelope. So for now, it's the GitHub is basically done. The rest of it is, other items that are probably more around marketing or something. We have some documentation stuff for the ENF that we're finishing up, but that's not related to this. Obviously, things like EOS.js, which was dormant for 2 years. We have someone that's working on that. When we feel the time is right, we'll bring it across. There's also some other client libraries like Java for Android and Swift for iPhone that we will start to bring across. But for the most part, everything we need for the coalition in terms of GitHub is done, and hopefully you all have gotten your invites, or you'll get them, today or tomorrow for the new repos, for the new organization. Is that more of what you're looking for?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much for this extensive and comprehensive explanation. Okay. Very nice. So talking about you touched documentation. Justin is not here due to obvious reasons. So because he just been how you say, he just got father. So so he probably has one reason not to be here at the moment. But he did raise the question in Telegram about documentation on Antelope. I'm not 100% sure what exactly he meant. It was more related to the website itself, but probably also like how-tos. But Ted, you probably know what
field
he's talking
some
about.
of that if you don't mind.
Yes.
So what we have thought, and this is obviously the coalition can try to come together. There's documentation off of TELOS. There's documentation hanging off of Wax. I don't know about UX, but we intended to keep documentation hanging off EOSnetwork.com. So we were going to have a docs.eosnetwork.com as well as a devhub.eosnetwork.com. And the reason being, this is our onboarding experience about how to get going onto our network, how developers would work on our network. And I think making a Antelope documentation where it's really kind of core generic, but not aimed at a actual operating chain is doesn't make sense, because how you would do something on Wax is slightly different than how you might do it on EOS and versus, yes, the smart contract probably looks the same, but onboarding, et cetera. So my thought would be for Antelope, we would explain that we're a coalition and we would point to the documentation sets of each of the partners, because people that are going to come up are either going to be looking to join one of the chains, or they might be looking to run their own version. And from there, they can decide to go off and look at the chains. And that way, each chain kind of continues to manage their documentation stack and their, and their flavors on how they onboard and how they try to train developers. And, obviously Wax would be gearing people probably more towards NFTs or GameFi, et cetera. So that's what we have been doing and planning to do. Now, if that's not what the coalition believes, then obviously it can be open up for discussion. And we have today, we have 4 people that are on our developer relations team and that do documentation, that do all of this. So that we're obviously investing a lot in that. And, if we were to say, no, those all are our coalition, then, that's something I guess that's up to the coalition to decide. Those costs, though, probably would then need to be borne by the coalition. It's just up to each team to decide, do they really feel the same about the documentation, et cetera. We have not rolled ours out yet. You can tell 3 of these people came from Block 1. So if you go to developers.eos.io, you can see we know how that was all built. We've rewritten parts of the stuff that weren't open sourced, and you can imagine, other than the branding, et cetera, it will have some look and feel like that does. Plus the new things that are being built by Nathan James for the Dev Hub, which will be a lot of video content and the likes. And it all pretty much centers around, again, working on EOSIO. But that's just what we're thinking now. And I guess it's up to the coalition to decide if that feels fine or if there's a different desire.
Well, I'll speak for TELOS. The developers.eos.io is something we link out to in a lot of places. I feel like, generally speaking, and kind of to what Justin mentioned, although I wanted to bring this up on a call 2 weeks ago, it wasn't time. But I feel like, when you look at software, it's documented, right? So like, as we pay people to improve features, you typically document when you add features, right? Like all the plugins and everything that I've always used developers.eos.io for is documenting the code that is now Antelope, right? So now suggesting that there won't be a site that documents that core software.
There is.
And that would suggest that each chain would need to document it itself, or we would just reference to the EOS documentation, which, we were already referencing to EOS.io and had problems with the naming conflict there. To me, I would say that there's something missing for Antelope then. And what you guys are building may be partially generic and partially for EOS. And I will say we will always have documentation for TELOS, but to have our documentation contain all of the plugin configuration parameters for NodeOS, for instance, or just all the standard contract APIs and types and how to use the asset and the symbol classes and things like that. To me, it feels like that documentation doesn't belong being written by 4 different networks, plus all the other networks that aren't part of the coalition.
So let me give you just to throw this out there. We, differently than what Block One did, we've open sourced the tools that generate the documentation that will live out at docs.eosnetwork.com. So it generally comes by scraping the source code, by going into the docs directory under Leap, by looking in the welcome directory. So all of these things are things that that will now be open source, that you'll be able to look at them and say, okay, do we want this? Do we want that? So you could use that and generate the TELOS version. Otherwise, we would either need to decide, and this just makes it more complex, and then we'll need to push costs back into the coalition to say, oh, okay, well, if a lot of what we're doing is now going to be sitting under Antelope, then we need to spread those costs, but then we're going to always have stuff that would stay at docs.eosnetwork.com. So, either you guys could link to docs.eosnetwork.com. You used to link to EOS developers.eos.io. You could use the tool that we built that now reads all the directories and scrapes all the files and builds it, and just modify the part that makes it where it lands on TELOS in the TELOS branding. Or again, we would have to then go back and look and say, okay, we're going to split the documentation, which we have not been planning on. And in splitting it, put some stuff under Antelope, and then it's confusing to people. Well, there's some stuff here in Antelope, but if you want to use EOS, there's stuff over here, but then part of it's over at Antelope. I mean, that's possible. It just hasn't been where we're at. And then we would need to look at those costs to push those into the coalition, which they won't be that much. You guys know the ratios are heavily, lighter on the non-EOS chains. So it's doable, but I think if you look at the tool that we built, which is now open source, which Block One did not open source, you could take it and make the documentation and then decide what parts you're going to include, what parts you're going to exclude, how to put your special sauce about onboarding and resource management, et cetera. So people know if they're a TELOS user, they just go to docs.telos.com or whatever, and you have all the assets and the tools to make that. That's one path. The other path is to split the documentation, put things that are deemed to be common over on Antelope. And now we're telling developers, hey, if you want to come and work on EOS, here's a whole bunch of stuff, but we're going to put you for some of it back over to Antelope. It's that I think is harder, and it's a little more confusing. And this way you wouldn't have to be pointing them anywhere. You'll have the documentation. And it's just a matter of running scripts that periodically kick off in GitHub when a push occurs. All of a sudden it kicks off and updates your documentation. That's the path we're going right now. But again, this is up for the coalition to decide. I'm just telling you where we're at this very minute. We can obviously it's all software. It's all changeable.
Okay. Well, that's fair. I mean, does that mean that you at EOS are going to consistently cover the cost of documenting all the software that is built into Antelope?
Yeah, we at this point have planned. I mean, that would be more of an Eve call, but we have planned that any of the software that the main teams are writing as long as it gets into the documents, the MD files that are living and some of the Doxygen files that are living in the repos, we had to go back.
We have to.
And reverse.
I mean, the answer is yes, we have to.
Yeah. So we reverse engineer.
If we want to offer Antelope to our user base, then we need to ensure that the documentation is present. I would think that the tool, the key differentiator here is that the tool that we've built is now open source. Other people can use it to scrape and then put your flavor on it. That way, you're not bearing any of the costs in Antelope. You're not really bearing any of the costs internally, other than creating your flavor of that we need to document anyways. Ideally, so we find ourselves in a situation over and over. We're having some very similar discussions where if Antelope was an entity, fast forward 5 years, 10 years in the future, if Antelope really was a huge thing and it had staff and it had a large budget and stuff, all of that really would fall under Antelope. But right now, the reality is a lot of what we're doing at EOS is really what Antelope should be doing. And so we're wearing the two hats kind of by default. And so, yes, we will have to bear those costs.
But there's another thing. You guys can update the documents now. You guys all have ability to open PRs against the repo.
Yeah.
And so you're like, hey, I think the documentation on this smart contract stuff is not up to snuff. And you guys can go in, update it, increase it, make it better. And then now it flows out to WAX, TELOS, and EOS doc stuff, because now they can all be generated complete head to bottom from these generators. And you can, decide to modify your generator and hold some stuff, make it where it pulls some stuff out of the TELOS repos, like you have some special TELOS stuff. So your generator that's maybe been forked, or you run the one common generator with a -TELOS flag, and it then says, oh, go over, grab these things out of the TELOS repo in addition. And so the generators become a little bit more powerful, and they're using all the core things, but also using all the special sauce that WAX and TELOS have. That makes it where now the documentation sets are complete on your site. And that's what kind of harmed you in the past, is Block One wouldn't open source the darn, generator. And it is now, and we're happy to share it with you and have, one of our engineers, a guy that built it from scratch, talk to you directly and help you with it. But again, that's the route you guys all land on.
Yes.
Okay. So knowing that there's the generators, open source is good. I feel two things. One is a question, and the other is that, if the generator, like you said, could have a configuration kind of behavior, like we demonstrated, we parameterized the Explorer, so it's, easily deployed by anybody.
Yes.
That, but I'll just have to see what it looks like. Cause yeah, that would be fine if we can just run the generator and contribute to what it generates from, and run it to produce our own documentation. Yep. That works as well, and it does, like you said, make a better user experience for any developers going to one site and getting all the docs, even if it's the same exact documentation that they would see on other network sites, because it's generated from the same source files. That just would be better. So that leads into my question, which is, does it produce and at one point I tried to reverse engineer that documentation generator as well. Does it produce the, whatever that library is, Gatsby front end code, like in its entirety, or does it produce markdown files that can be used in any type of documentation framework?
I believe it does both, unfortunately. In the end, it all ends up producing, I believe, HTML out on the final site. But I do believe there's some interim markdown files. I'll connect you with Eric Passmore, who wrote 100% of the code, who's now an employee of ours, and he'll be happy to help. And the goal would be, you'd put in PRs to change the generator to be more flexible.
Yeah.
You put in PRs on the documentation stuff that you felt was weak. And, it really becomes a coalition effort at that point. And, you've got hooks in the generator that make it do the things you need it to do. And then if WAX or EOS doesn't want those hooks, it just doesn't run, because we don't have that flag set when we run the generator.
Yeah, we just read launched from Gitbook to Docusaurus, which is working out pretty well. And so if using the generator means we have to switch to a third framework and move everything we've written into that, then it would kind of be, so that's why, like, if there's an interim markdown and we could just short circuit an off ramp of the markdown files into.
I hate to say this, but I think it uses like 3 different sub generators under it, just based on what the files were and what it was scraping. Like, it uses, for the Java stuff, for the Java API, it uses Java docs. I mean, that's horrible to admit to you, but it uses Docusaurus, I think. There's a whole bunch in there. And so what he tried to do was do mostly what had been done, and maybe with a little bit newer technology than had been used in the original one. We were able to talk to the engineer that had written the original generator, even though he could not give us the source code. And so it unfortunately probably is not as pretty as you're hoping. I can go poke around and see if I can see the repo. It should be public, and I'll share it in the chat here if I can find it, and you can start to look at the horrible mess it is. But I mean, it does work. And we can probably let you see where we are so far in the version, the replaced version. We have it password protected. It's at docs.eosnetwork.com. So you get an idea of what the generator is doing. We're not 100% done yet, but I will give you the repo link. This one, I don't think that they've pushed across yet over to Antelope, because we hadn't discussed this, but I'm totally okay with it. I mean, it's Eve's decision and it's a coalition's decision, but it seems like a logical thing to do, to move it over.
Okay, well, that sounds good on the documentation front. This drives now Stephen's comment about the contracts. Just wanted to be clear on that. But we can finish the documentation conversation first. I just want to dovetail into the contracts based on Stephen's comment.
For documentation, Aaron, can you chime up, please?
Yeah, I didn't want to derail the questions that Jesse was asking. This kind of relates to the SDKs as well. The SDKs are going to have their own documentation portal because it's for a specific audience. And the way that both Block 1 did it, and it sounds like the ENF is now doing it, is like this omnibus documentation. And I think it may be worth exploring breaking that apart for different audiences into different documentation things. Like, you need to consider this as kind of like a 7-layer salad or something, where there are different levels in which different audiences are going to want to be reaching, and some of those are identical across different networks. Like Telos is a good example. The APIs and the LEAP implementation details, they're going to be identical to EOS. And Wax is only going to have one variation of that, which is the RSA or whatever it is. There is, unless for branding purposes, you guys all want to drive and duplicate effort, it would make sense to have that be one thing for each topic, as opposed to multiple portals that all cover everything. The SDKs are already going in this direction with the proposal we had, but arguably the APIs should have their own. LEAP as an implementation may need its own. And the smart contracts, which are like the special sauce to each network, those realistically should be unique to each network, but that's the only thing that should be unique to each network. Everything else is going to be identical, and it's a lot of duplicated effort. So maybe structurally, breaking this apart into a project with multiple documentation portals for different purposes, for different audiences, that can all be tied together through the various websites for the various networks, would be a more logical approach.
So it's not duplicated effort if it's all coming from the same source and just landing in different landing. I don't know if you were saying you don't believe that people should have a unified documentation on EOS for the EOS network and TELOS for the TELOS network. If it's all pulling from repos that are both common and disparate, and makes it where TELOS has its own version of documentation versus EOS, and yet nothing was duplicated. It's just the scanner parser thing has a flag to make it land a little bit differently. I'm not sure if you're saying you disagree with that, or you're saying that's fine, but that there would be parts that were common, which my proposal has. All the common code stays common, and that the disparate code stays different out in TELOS repos. Like when TELOS is talking about their system contract, they pick that up and get it on their website. That way, people that are TELOS people go to TELOS for all their documentation, even the common stuff, and people that are EOS go to EOS for it.
That won't, I guess what I'm saying is that won't be the case with how the SDK proposal is written right now. There will be one SDK website that TELOS, WAX, EOS all link to for the documentation. And that is for a very specific audience. I don't anticipate that each of these networks would replicate that documentation into their own documentation.
Why couldn't they? Why couldn't they make their scrapers pick that up?
Why should they?
Because they want their documentation in one place for their network.
Do you see all of the various EVM networks reproducing the hard hat documentation for their own purposes? They don't. No, they just link to it because it's common across all EVM networks.
Right. Well, the issue is, do you think a developer wants to go to 8 websites or one website to learn stuff? A lot of this is already done. We already have it in one place. We're offering it to TELOS. So maybe the SDK can stand out by itself, and SDK is link out to the SDK because it's special and it's going to live over in its own website. But the rest of this is already put in one nice package where it's all linked together. And why would we break it up and put it into 8 different places when we can have it in one? And if SDK wants to be different, it can be different.
It's because Block 1's attempt at documentation was a failure. There was too much information for different audiences all in one place. The separation of information based on the type of audience that you are seeking to educate is incredibly important. I, as a developer, this is not out of will, I have not done smart contract development. And all of the documentation that I need as an operator and as a client developer is mixed in with these smart contract development.
We're working to separate that. That's what having a single documentation team, which we built now, and we have a different person writing the scrapers and stuff. We're starting to tease that apart and fix it. And instead of having just random people putting documentation all over the place and people hoping they find it.
Isn't that what's happening if you are encouraging TELOS to replicate this behavior? How do search engines deal with this stuff? If there are 4 of the identical page about...
For TELOS, you go to the TELOS website. If you're going to code for EOS, you go to the EOS website.
Developers search for things. Developers aren't going to go to the TELOS website explicitly unless they're getting started. But for example, when they're going to start searching for the send transaction to API, do we want one search result to pop up for every single Antelope network that exists, or do we want one unified source?
Only the ones that want to make their own documentation and change it the way they want it, that want to customize their documentation the way they want it. Otherwise,
okay.
Seems
so
like
the send transaction endpoint, which network would want to change that?
I'm talking about how they want their documents laid out, how they want them formatted, how they want the branding on their page to go. If they want their network to look as though they have their documentation, they'll want that. But if they're like, hey, we've given up, everything's just Antelope now. And then who really owns the brand Antelope? Who's taking the pride in Antelope, and who's making sure that everything's being perfectly done there? Because now the very little documentation that's left, and then, this almost does feel like now we need to make the Antelope organization and move these people all over into Antelope. And in reality, I think that's just a lot of overhead.
Where there's standalone
works and is available right now.
Where they are standalone projects, like we will be doing with the SDKs, that if you are a web developer that wants to leverage Antelope,
the SDKs aren't
where
done.
you start.
I mean, but you're not talking about standalone projects right now, Aaron. You're talking about the legacy that's not a standalone project right now.
No, I am talking about the like the client SDK frameworks that exist, or Dune,
Yes, that's
or
going
the smart
forward.
contracts. These are things that exist today, or purely Leap API documentation for somebody that needs to know what the structure of the APIs are. Like that is a very specific subset of developers that exist. As a developer, yeah.
Oh, I'd like to make a suggestion, because I am hearing good arguments on both sides. They're real arguments, and not that this is an argument, but in terms of good points being made on each side. There are other coalitions essentially in our industry that have already had to tackle this, and I think we could learn something about what works, what doesn't work, how people respond to it, whether they love it or hate it or whatever, by looking at, how does Ethereum do this? How does more to the point, how does Cosmos do this? How does so I think that since there is somebody who's already done this and their communities have had a chance to respond, I think we could learn a lot by taking a look at those. And I would also say that I heard, Ted, you said, hey, well, if this ultimately 5 years from now, this needs to be, which would make most sense to be under Antelope. I actually think that if we are making decisions, as we make decisions here, I would encourage us to the extent we can not to make short-term decisions, right? If we say, okay, well, this is the most productive way right now, but the real way long-term is we should do this. I would say once you set up a framework and a solution, it doesn't change. So if we really know that one way is right, whether that's different or takes a little bit more, I just think that we should think about that as well.
I agree with that, but there also could be the case where one chain says, I just want to point at the central stuff in Antelope, and another chain says, no, I want to have it all in one-stop shopping for my user. Why are we going to force all chains to do it one way? If some chains say, look, we're not going to force documentation on my chain, we should allow that. And then we should allow the other chain to say, put it on Antelope, because it's just as easy for us to make a generator for Antelope because we've already made the generator that works for EOS. Now, again, who's going to be taking care of all the branding and all the styling and all this stuff? It's like, for us, this was the direction we were going. And we've decided that this is how we want to build it, because we do have stuff that's separate and only special for EOS, the EOS network. We shouldn't make a decision that forces all the coalitions to have to do that. If it's common documentation and you want to handle it one way and another chain wants to handle it another, if the tools are available to do that, why wouldn't we allow them to do that?
Well, I don't think you're stopping anybody from doing it. I think if the tools are available, they will, and somebody wants to do it, they will. The question is really, is there going to be a unified central database, or document repository? I can see, again, I am truly not decided on either side, because I can see strong arguments in favor of both ways. But I do think that when I start hearing things like, oh, hey, we're going to need more, we should do it this way someday, my ears perk up and I'm like, well, someday, today is also someday. And these things get baked in if we don't do it in the right way. And the other thing that I think is, I think all of us have a vision for Antelope that is much bigger than these 4 chains or the 6 or 7, prominent chains that exist now. I think part of the strength that we present is that there's going to be, scores or hundreds of chains or thousands, God, someday, right? Do we want that many? Does it make more sense to have a central repository, or to have that can maybe spread out to others, or do we want to have our own?
Is that in our best interest, or is at some point the chains will try to differentiate each other, right? If we're trying to differentiate from each other, our developer and onboarding experience should differentiate. And we believe we've hired some good people to do that. And we're trying to make our chain work. We're sharing as much as we can, but at some point, the marketing, developer outreach, those pieces should probably differentiate towards, hey, we're Wax, we're NFT, we're maybe GameFi, and we want our documents and our developer outreach to look one way. And we're EOS.
Isn't Aaron saying neither? Isn't Aaron saying neither? So it's like not either of these options that are currently being discussed. He's saying just no central repository, just they live elsewhere in the respective field that they came from.
These documents already live.
Yes, so that's the part I'm saying is, how do you split those up then, Aaron? Where do they currently live, the ones that are currently there?
I think,
where did they get sent to? Who hosts them? The ones that currently exist, not the new ones, the ones that currently exist.
What do you mean the ones that currently exist?
So the current documentation already exists. So I agree with you. Let's say SDKs, it lives on your own place. And new ones in the future.
What currently exists, though?
All the developers
that already exists.
There's a ton of documentation out there on a ton of different SDKs, APIs.
Who takes ownership of that? So you're saying SDKs, for example, would be under the ownership of Greymass. That makes sense. You're creating it. But who takes ownership of the documentation that already exists, or where's that hosted?
Ultimately, it should be hosted by Antelope, and then the chains can glue it together. Right now, the way this is being set up, and we keep driving back to the chains and the marketing of chains, and I get that that's important. But the way this is being assembled now is you are smashing all of the topics into one book, whereas we need each individual chapter to be available independently, so that way chains can glue them together for marketing purposes the way that they believe.
There was
I don't understand that part.
For 2 years, we're working towards that. We haven't revealed it yet, but that is the point: is to make them different chapters and even multiple books. But the scraper, the tool that's been built, allows the chains to make it look differently for how they want it done. And I've shared the repo for that, what we've already developed to get that mostly working.
If we let's look at this from a different angle. We've identified one of the major groups that we want to be very friendly towards are Web 2 developers who are their job now involves coming to Web 3. And one of the strengths we have is, rather than those people having to immediately choose what chain they're going to go on, they are first choosing technology, which I think is aligned with how a major company or large organization is going to work. Which of these technologies are we going to go to? Are we going to go with Antelope? We're going to go with Cosmos? We're going to go with Polkadot? Or what are we? And then once that decision is made on its own merits, then they will further refine into what particular chain they go on. Not everyone will do this, but I think enough people would take that process, and that's maybe the more likely process for enterprises. So if we have that, if that is the case, that to me suggests that there should be a central Antelope repository, because that's in line, because otherwise they have to go to the individual chain level. And I do think that these are things we went to the question of, well, who maintains this? We've always known that we would have to have some kind of organization, even if it's just a one employee organization. You need to have somebody whose job it is to stay on top of these things, to really care more about Antelope than any single chain. Until you have that, and until you have that structure, it really isn't going to fill the needs we set out for it. So those are two things I wanted to share.
So we have that today. And I think the thing that's getting lost here is, at some point, each chain is going to try to differentiate itself and grow its user base, grow its developer base. So if we make it where, nope, that's only done at Antelope, you have to decide if you're Antelope first, and all the developer relation stuff is just in Antelope, And then later you'll just accidentally fall into EOS or TELOS or WAX. I disagree with that. I think what needs to happen up front is the chains start differentiating their developer kind of outreach program and showing that, hey, this is what we're developing for. This is the type of developer we're trying to attract. Our marketing materials, our developer relations program is pulling in people, because eventually there will be a limited number of developers coming in to the overall ecosystem. And sure, we hope that the four of us are the four survivors, or maybe there's 5 or 6 survivors.
I think that the flaw in that thinking is that applications are only going to choose one chain. I think that with EVM being a prime example of why this isn't true, is that applications seek to deploy on as many chains as possible. They aren't focused on a single chain, and this single app, single chain mentality has been baked into this ecosystem for so long, and it's not how we're moving forward.
Look at NFTs right now, dominated by Wax, right? If you're an NFT developer in EOS world, you're going to go Wax. Wax is trying to say they're the gaming and they're the NFT group. We are already differentiating. And I think that we have to realize that part of that is the developer outreach. If we say we're going to take all of our documentation and all of our developer outreach and centralize it into Antelope, it's stopping the chains from differentiating and actually it's neutering marketing. We would have to centralize marketing. At some point, the ultimate completion of this would be put all 4 of these chains together and make one chain, because they can't differentiate, they can't market differently, they can't have separate developer outreach. Let's just combine them into one chain, combine all their finances, combine all their people, do a layoff, and we're just one big chain. We have to have the ability to differentiate at the very core, at developer relations, at token holders and the likes. And so to me, developer relations and your documentation are one of the biggest assets you have to go after the developer community, including, making them pick us versus Wax, or us versus TELOS, or us versus UX. And so, that's why I feel strongly about this, that
we're not documenting
centralize everything, then you've cut that ability to differentiate off.
I really disagree. I think that those things can be separate. I think that naturally will be separate. I don't think that a core documentation of our shared elements and tools that we're putting together. I mean, we're sharing the development, we're sharing those things. Why then would we have 4, and later on N separate documentation efforts for the core stuff?
They're not separate, Douglas. There's one repo where all the there's multiple repos where the documents live. All of you have write access to those repos. You can make enhancements when you want. There's a open source scraper that lets you land them into whatever format you want, in addition to changing all the branding around it. So you don't have to make them look the way EOS chose or Wax chose. The way you modify the scraper makes it where they land in different directories, land in a different format. And that's the beauty. You can make your document look very differentiated from EOS's or from Wax's, but it's all coming from the same centralized source. The documents themselves live inside the repos, and all of you have write access to those. The way they are instantiated onto your websites is completely up to you, and just as a matter of how much time do you want to modify the generator that is actually reading those documents that are in the repos and putting them out in HTML on the website. So you can control how much you want to invest in developer relations, how much you want to invest in differentiation, how much you care about your branding to make your experience so much different than EOS's or Wax's. And, I will agree with one thing. I will agree that the way Block1 did it was crap, but, that's that. And we're going to all surpass that, I'm sure. But I do believe we will all share the same common tools and documents. How we make them look and how we promote them and how we emphasize one part versus the other will be up to the chains independently. And I think that is important.
So I would basically second what Douglas said, and I also feel strong about that, because I personally also think it's like the differentiation and development outreach. I personally don't think it's mainly based on how the documents look like. It's more like, do I find what I'm looking for? Obviously, there's two components. It's the general open source documentation, which is maintained by Antelope in some way, by the coalition, and those that contribute to the code. And then there are the chain specialties. So obviously, if we have a centralized repository or kind of website that's the place to go for Antelope, then we still have to resolve the issue of the specialities for TELOS, WEX, whatever. So if you want to understand our decide voter and governance, you will have to have a different TELOS site that is including that kind of information. But I strongly think that since we built this coalition to streamline our efforts and have a common code base, it's kind of, I think it's very valuable to have this kind of documentation on an Antelope page, which everybody can reference to and say, this is our core code. This is where it's documented. There you find all the information, and there you find the SDK documentations. And if you want to know specialties of TELOS, UX, WEX, whoever, here you find some more links which could be maintained a different way. So I think it's like the power of Antelope is that we work together and have this documentation at one place and can direct people. What I do second is that, and I put in a piece into the agenda, is like a lead management part. So what happens if any new dApp is entering the Antelope website and says, oh yeah, I'm interested, I want to discuss with somebody how I can spin up my own chain, or how can I spin out a side chain on one of the other chains. So how do we manage this? Who is having access to the info and outreach email boxes, and who will pick up those calls if somebody's interested in any Antelope topics? I think that's kind of playing together. But the general documentation for Antelope, I think it belongs to Antelope, to the coalition. It should be maintained centrally. That's my personal opinion.
It is maintained centrally. It'll be sitting, and we'll move it in the central Antelope repos. There'll be a central open source scraper. That's not a question of, is the documentation centralized? It's a question of, do the chains have an ability to use it as a branding asset and to differdifferentiate?
But then may I raise a question then? But because you obviously you were doing this for EOS, you have significantly more resources than us, the smaller chains. So that's fair, and somebody needs to configure that scraper and keep it up to date. So question though is then, as we have a repository for Antelope, will we also use that scraper to create an Antelope repository page website that includes all the documentation?
It could be done. You could have an Antelope generic one, but again, Antelope is not a thing. You don't run on the Antelope chain. You run on EOS, TELOS, WEX, or UX. And so to me, I mean, sure, we could put it there, but what I don't want to see is that people take away the ability for the change. This is part of marketing. Developer relations is an important way that a chain differentiates to say, this is why you should pick me. Because after Douglas's first step of first you've decided to go Antelope, the second step is now, how do I decide if it's WEX, UX, TELOS, or EOS? And this is part of that. We have to allow marketing to have an asset to use to to grow. We're all going to try to compete. Hopefully the people like FIO and Proton and Ultra just get slaughtered from this. But in the end, there's just a finite pie that's going to be divided. And we have to realize that we have to allow the people in the coalition to also differentiate. I'm okay if we also throw one out on Antelope as well. But the point is, we shouldn't say no, EOS can't put one out for themselves. And again, it's all open source. You can look at the code, you can modify it, you can, in the documentation, every time we fix something in the documentation, you all get it. So
yeah,
well, I don't think anyone has said that. It's never been my understanding that part of the conversation is that chains cannot also put out their own. Yeah. Right.
That's what
I have no problem with that. I mean, I expect everyone will put out their own. The question is there going to be a central place where people who are new to this are going to go?
Is there anything stopping the coalition from taking that generator and spitting out a Antelope themed?
No, there's not. The thing I was going to recommend is that on the docs.antelope page, we say, here are our coalition members and here's their documents. And it's just a simple page, docs.antelope.io. And it shows, here's EOS, here's TELOS, here's UX, here's WAX. And you go, oh, great. So there is a docs. It comes up if you Google Antelope's docs, it comes right up and it tells you, hey, there's 4 chains in our coalition. Here's theirs, here's, blah, blah. And you go that way. That instead of duplicating it a 5th time. But that way you've allowed the chains to market and differentiate, because we have a developer outreach program we're trying to put together that probably is not the same as what WAX is trying to do, or maybe UX or TELOS. And it shouldn't be. These should be differentiated to allow us to try to, grow our businesses, right? I mean, we should cooperate as much as possible. We're centralizing the documents, we're centralizing the scraper, but how you embody that with the marketing and the brand around it should be differentiated. So my recommendation would, the Antelope just has docs.antelopes.io, and it points at the 4 documentation areas that you could go to. And people say, oh yeah, Antelope is a coalition. It shares this base code, the documentation, but the chains, there's no Antelope chain running. I can't run an Antelope. Now's my time, since I've gotten to this page in Google, now's my time to try to figure out, do I want to be on EOS, TELOS, WAX? Oh, well, let me kind of look at their documentation. Let me look at their developer relations outreach program and stuff. So but
there is going to be there is going to be an Antelope testnet chain.
But that's quite a bit farther downstream. When you're testnet, but I think there need to be 4 independent testnets. I'm okay with an Antelope testnet. It'd be very generic though, right? Because it would just run the vanilla contract, right? And we'll agree with you guys to make the vanilla so that it's not the same as EOS. And so it won't be the same as TELOS, won't be the same as WAX, but that'll be a little less useful. I mean, we want people, once you've made your decision, you use the testnet for what you decided. If you went WAX, you use WAX testnet. If you went TELOS, you use TELOS testnet, just like there's TELOS defuse and EOS defuse. And so I think that's a secondary decision after you've already decided you're a TELOS guy or you're a WAX guy.
I'd just like to chime in, please. Aaron wrote in the chat, and maybe Aaron, if you can explain, because I don't understand. Point number 1 and point number 2 seem to very much conflict each other. So if documenting them across every chain is bad because there's duplication is bad, but also centralizing it is bad, I don't understand what you're suggesting.
The first message is about duplicating the same content across multiple places, right? So that's just about content. It's largely about SEO. As a developer, I don't go to developers.eosio, like that domain, like that's not what I type. I search Google for the subject matter that I'm looking for.
Let Aaron speak, please.
And Google takes me to that place. If that content is replicated across X networks and there are X search results, it doesn't make sense. Those are competing. People with better domains are going to be higher in the search engines, et cetera. Yep. So the second one about it being assembled into one place isn't about it being assembled under a chain. It is the documentation subject matter being all squished together. I'm looking at the DevDocs repo right now, and this list of coverage that it's talking about services probably a dozen different professions. The
Right.
audience
You
is
haven't seen
what
how
I'm
it's being
talking about
split up.
centralizing.
On the web side, it can be split up differently. First, we had to reproduce something that was missing.
Understand that.
So it won't be the way it was done on EOS.io. We'll eventually split it up to block producers, developers, node operators, etc., so that you come in as what is my use case, but that's not the way it was. We're just trying to, we went from 0 about 3 weeks ago to where now we've actually got it actually generating stuff from nothing. So yes.
Would it make sense? Because I just like listening to you guys. There's some key questions here, and I think there's a more agreement than maybe you guys are talking about, like the duplication of the documentation, for example. It seems like that is a guiding principle where you don't want that duplication to happen. You want to be efficient and the knowledge sharing to go across the chain. How do you make that happen? There might be a couple of different solutions there, but maybe a list of, maybe going back to Douglas's suggestion of this has been done, not just in the blockchain world, but in other places, right, for open source. What are some of the, practices that are being deployed there, and with learning is there, and then also having a list of those key kind of guiding principles for the coalition around how this would work, and having those tested by the use cases, right? If a developer comes in, they hit this website, they're trying to solve this problem, where do they go? How do we streamline it? Because we cannot compete against ourselves, right? We've got to give them the best experience possible.
Thank you for mentioning that, and I do agree. And I would also say, guys, this is not moving towards a resolution. This is obviously a complex issue that we have to have more discussion on. And so I wanted to go back and ask Kirsten, do you think that we've reached a point in this conversation where we should table this and create a separate work group for discussions so that we can get back to the other business on the agenda?
That's a very good point. Thank you for that, Douglas. Yes, I would.
I support.
I would like to propose that because we have some like two general positions that are kind of, I don't know, fixed as of today. So we won't, as you say, we won't gain resolution here and find a solution. So it does make sense to build a work group that is considering all those different things, performs a benchmark on how do the other chains and chain coalitions work on these topics, and how have they been successful or not successful doing this. So I would propose to really do this. So thank you for that proposal, Douglas, which I pick up. So as very active in this discussion, Ted, Aaron, I would propose that you would in any way be part of that work group. Is there anybody, if you like?
Yeah, I feel I have a pretty strongly vested interest in
yes.
my view. Jesse probably should be there, or Justin, one of those two from TELOS, or Douglas, it doesn't matter, but we should have a TELOS person on there.
And I think we can contribute someone as well from the UX side.
The one thing that I would ask is, Aaron has not actually gotten a chance to speak for more than 30 seconds without somebody interrupting him. And so I still do not understand what Aaron is trying to say, not because he's not trying to explain it, but nobody can give him more than 30 seconds to actually say it. So in this subgroup, please give Aaron a chance to speak so that we can actually understand what he's trying to convey. Whether or not it's good or bad, that is a whole separate issue, but please give him time to speak.
So Aaron, you want to
we can shelve this for the subcommittee, but just recognize that not everybody has the capacity to jump over other people, and or they do not want to do that. And Aaron is not able to actually get his point across. He's not given the time or the space to be able to do so. And for me, ultimately, to be able to make a decision on whatever, I need to hear all viewpoints. And I'm currently not hearing all viewpoints of how this could go about.
I'll put myself on mute. I'll restrict myself from touching my mouse. And why don't we let Aaron tell you, and I will not interrupt.
I do agree that perhaps it would be worthwhile to have a particular group for this.
Yes.
And everybody seems to agree with that. Just word of caution in general, like this conversation was very heated. We need to give each other space to speak, please.
Thank you for raising this, Eve. That's a question of respect, which I totally agree and second that. So
and with that, I think we can move to the next item.
Yes, question.
And in the channel, we can coordinate when this subgroup can meet and speak.
Yes. Is anybody else that would insist to be on that work group?
I definitely want to listen in. I'm gonna have popcorn.
Okay, so we raised that in the coalition group.
Can I ask about the contracts just so I understand? It wasn't on the agenda, but
which contracts?
Stephen just pointed out that the EOS system contracts are going to be on the ENF repo. I just was curious, does that mean there's no more reference Antelope contracts like there was EOSIO contracts?
So anything that's EOS specific is going to be maintained in the EOS system contracts moving forward. That's going to remain inside of the ENF org. Everything else that's needed should be supplied through Antelope.
Okay, so historically, this is a change in that EOS has always just ran EOSIO contracts, right? So I guess I'm curious, what are the things that are unique to EOS that won't be in Antelope, given that up until now, there has not been any difference between EOSIO and EOS?
Right. And just recently, in this call, it was, you guys shared that you would be doing, there would be a vanilla version that would be on testnet or whatever, but it would exist. And that it would not just be the EOS version. So if that is the case, then that has to be hosted somewhere that isn't any of our chains, that what we're calling the vanilla version. So maybe that's something that doesn't have power up or something like that. But that reference version needs to live somewhere. The documentation for it does. And the idea of primarily supporting this on a chain by chain basis doesn't provide a place for that. So I think that's something to discuss in the subcommittee.
Yes,
I think Jesse makes a good point there about just where do we find vanilla Antelope?
Well, as Antelope
any single
iterates,
implementation.
As Antelope iterates and things are done, there's going to need to be, as a chain that has always been operating as EOSIO contracts plus our changes, there is now a plus EOS's changes that it sounds like you're going to be maintaining in your ENF repo, of course, just like we have to maintain our changes in TELOS repo. But I just want to, make sure that we protect that Antelope and the reference contracts are still, fully maintained as part of iterating Antelope itself.
Yeah, I don't think that there's any change in trajectory or strategy here. I think that the plan is to continue to maintain those.
Okay. And do you have any examples of what the EOS changes are? Like, what's the difference between Antelope and EOS?
I can take the action item of giving you some clearer details line by line of what all's entailed inside of that repo. But I do believe, at least like anecdotally, that DPoS is part of that.
DPoS?
Delegated proof of stake
Is part of
the EOS system contracts.
Oh, I think that's wrong. So then what is the Antelope system contracts?
The majority of that should be captured inside of the LEAP related materials. But again, I can work on getting you more clarity on that. I apologize. I'm not better prepared for that right now.
That's fine. I'm just trying to understand, you have everything up until like this new release that was in the vanilla system contracts. So it seems like only things that are unique to EOS. And to draw back, like we've talked here at the coalition about the changes that TELOS has made and to the system contracts and improvements that we've made and that we need in the vanilla Antelope system contracts being brought in. And like for us, having maintained a set of changes on top of the vanilla system contract, the more things that we can put into those system contracts, even if they're added and removed through a compile flag, like making those system contracts configurable where you could have the EOS behavior or the TELOS behavior, almost like we have with the schedule, like it's sorted alphabetically or it's sorted by the location column. That was actually just a commented out line of code that you could switch. But for me, bringing as many of our changes into the vanilla implementations in a configurable way will allow us to have fewer changes that we maintain. So it seems like we talked about having more things in the system contracts that are configurable behaviors that we could all benefit from, and then are part of the code base that gets maintained in that kind of reference implementation. And then TELOS generally would like to have more of our things, if it makes sense, in the reference implementation as a configurable kind of behavior. But it sounds like you guys are kind of maybe going in a different direction, or maybe I just need to understand what it means, like what you're saying. And that's why I asked for the examples of what's going there versus what's going in Antelope. Like what are some examples of that? And DPoS feels like that's what Antelope is and what has been in the vanilla system contract since day one. So I think that's where I really want to see some clarity.
No problem. I'll get that list to the channel within like the next hour or so.
Sure, sounds good. And maybe we should, not right now, but discuss, what the plans are for the system contracts. I guess I'll wait to see what's on that list.
Yeah, why not? Because there are other things to tackle in this meeting, and we've spent a considerable amount of time on this, while very productively, and but not to anything that will get to a resolution. Why don't we move on to the next and but definitely tackle those issues in this committee, which Jesse, I really hope you'll be on, because I think you'd be represent not only TELOS well, but also developers and perhaps future chains that want to do extensive changes that would also then be included in the code, so that they would be available to other chains in the future and not require a special additional step in addressing any security patches or updates or anything like that.
Yeah, so let's move on. So we coordinate the group in Telegram. We've got the first part of the members, and what I would like to raise the question is for the P2P RFP and for the smart contract libraries. Is there anything else we need to cover for those, or what is the kind of timing for the RFP process now? Technically, we have approved the RFP. So the question is, what's the next step and by when?
Right. So Jeff had to drop, but the window closes for the intent to bid this coming Monday, where we'll be stepping into the next phase. As far as I know, there's been 2 responses thus far. That's the extent of details that I have related to that update, though.
Yeah, there's one from TELOS too. So I've been approached by one of our teams that wants to bid on the smart contract libraries part. So I probably check with Jeff tomorrow.
Make sure you refer them to the actual RFP that contains instruction on what needs to be done.
Yes, I already did that. They have the link to the repository. So working on that. I just wanted to mention that here.
And I apologize, I wasn't looking at the board. I just heard RFP. I was specifically talking about the smart contracts libraries. Is the request for an update on the P2P RFP?
I wanted to cover an update on both things.
Yeah.
So if you would like to share anything, then please feel welcome, Stefan.
This is just something that's still in progress for OCI, but they're still on schedule for getting their proposal put together. Jonathan Gleasack is the lead on that. But again, just to clarify, there have been 2 bids on the smart contract libraries, and I believe one of those was that group that knows the TELOS team.
Which one is that?
I'm sorry, I don't have those details.
Okay.
Jeff has the details.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. And for the P2P?
That's what I was saying. OCI is on track for getting those recs in.
Okay. Okay. We did have the discussion on the IBC contract parties and legal entity. So since we discussed overly at the beginning of the meeting that there will be basically three counterparties signing with UX, is this still a discussion point? Because we discussed that we would create a work group to discuss about legal entity for Antelope.
Yes, so the contract itself needs to be signed by the 3 separate parties as they currently exist. Yes. However, in the contract, it also calls for an entity to be created for the IP, correct? Yes. And that there's no progress. There's no, it has not moved. Now, with what I brought up at the beginning of the call, Guillaume, do you think that actually changes that requirement, or is it still essentially a requirement? I don't have an answer. I don't know. What do you think, Guillaume?
Well, I mean, if we just go and let's say open source the code, making it MIT, then we don't need that structure. It's still useful for other reasons, but we don't need that structure now to be referenced inside the agreement. So it's not an urgency. It's still, like I said, it's still useful to have that structure in place for many other reasons, but it's not a holdup. It's not a holdup for this.
And for IBC though, because we're not paying everything up front, the protection, the entity was there also to protect that you essentially get paid for completion of the work. Is that now potentially gone if there is no entity? Or does that still remain effectively because the 3 have signed the contract?
I don't think it was ever
it was more so for the transfer of the IP, right?
It was more for the transfer of the IP, because essentially the way we look at it is we have to share the IP to have it reviewed to be accepted. So that's like, we're going to share it anyway. It's more about like, when is it released to the general public, and then under what terms, and who is the I guess like a licensor, if it's applicable,
if that's
so on and so on. Yeah, exactly.
And that would require an
we're
actually entity, or but it may not require an actual entity if in the future, when we talked about, I guess the secret sauce there is whoever adopts it, if they're part of the official one, that's the kind of the value, and that doesn't require IP.
Exactly.
Whether or not though it requires an entity to do that, that's, I guess, separate.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay.
But then, yeah, like it's the way I think we still give that incentive to participate and to reach out to the coalition and to be a member is that in order to be listed, say, as one of the IBC partners under the official EOSIO dot blah 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 IBC, or like token or rep token or something, you have to be a member of the coalition, for example. And then like, doesn't like the code itself, you can run it if you want, but it's not going to be the one that we will be kind of putting in the spotlight. Like, you're not going to be like in that official instance, so to speak. So you'll have to build your own attention, you have to build your own liquidity, your own marketing, discovery, blah 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 blah. And it's a good luck. Good luck. Exactly.
Separate to this, I guess, the discussion of legal entity, one thing that it should be a consideration is that right now, essentially, the ENF is the one handling, I guess, the ENF. How can I say this? The Treasury, we invoiced out each individual chain so that you could send, so that on your end, you could have an invoice as to why you were sending funds to the Treasury. On our end, we don't have an invoice as to why we are potentially spending currently, we don't have an invoice. So those funds currently are counted by us. The issue there is then we have the tax liabilities for those funds that currently are sitting in the Treasury. Now that we have the SDK contract done, we would be able to showcase that those funds are, to be spent, but they don't account for 100% of the funds in the Treasury. And in the future, that will often remain the case. That is because we would be holding funds that we don't necessarily have an expense for at any given time. And even when we do have an expense for them, because we're milestone based in terms of payments, we're still sitting on funds potentially that are not expensed yet, which means, again, going back to this idea that then the ENF is taking on the tax liabilities for this. That's another area where I think Antelope having an entity would come in handy, because that would be removing that liability from the ENF. But now that would be putting the liability of tax burden on Antelope, the entity. So that may be where we want to continue that discussion anyways. We may be okay currently. We are going to try and leverage the same structure that we have for the grants that we have in EOS, whereby we say the Treasury isn't ours. We are a signatory of, so we're kind of stewards of, we are one of the signatures, but by ourselves, we cannot control those funds. But still, you guys have an invoice. We don't have an invoice on our end. And so that's kind of tricky. That legal entity may come into play at that time. Right now, not necessarily need if TLDR, but I don't want to necessarily drop the subject. So it's less of an issue now for IBC, more of an issue now for just Antelope as a whole.
Eventually, we're going to have to pick it up. And I think it's been good that we have not focused on it too much at this point, but my guess is that we're getting to the point where we should put some effort into it, because eventually something's going to come up where we need it, where none of the single chains want to, we don't want to be seen as a general partnership. That would be a messy, and we need some kind of form of legal entity to cover what we're doing. And we will need to hire a staff of at least one to speak for and and be the guardian of the aims of the coalition, as opposed to any single chain. So I think that this is probably a good time for us to start or restart that effort. And we've got a lot of our initial development is out of the way, the branding's out of the way. There's much work to do, but I think this is where we start. I don't think we should kick it down the road very far.
Agreed.
Agreed.
But again, in the context of the IBC, which is what this was brought first in, no longer necessary in that context.
Excellent. I just keep it as legal entity in here and added the comments, understanding that. Okay. So does anybody have like an update on the Scalability plus blue paper? I pushed this since July from meeting to meeting. So do we have any update on the progress there?
I do not.
I think
Neither do I.
The scalability calls have been canceled a few times, right?
Yeah, I mean, like there's basically like the scalability calls were mostly used for I guess until now for discussions about IBC and fast finality, but now everything that had to be discussed was discussed. So I guess like they're no longer needed, or not at this point. I think they will become needed again once the agreement is finalized and can move forward. And at that point, we'll probably start discussing with the ENF engineers, essentially like going over the code and making sure everything is okay, and eventually opening it up to more people for review. But yeah, like it's I guess like for the time being, they're not needed until the move forward with this. And then I don't think they ever were related to the paper. Like paper was mostly what Lucas has been working on, and I guess like there might be additional things we want to put in there, but seemed to me like it was kind of not necessarily necessary either. It was a bit of a different exercise I think we're trying to do at the time, and I don't know if it's still relevant at this point.
Does it make sense to reevaluate this when we do the reprioritization exercise, which is early September?
Yeah, I think so.
So then if everybody agrees, I will move that to the 8th of September item and discuss that at that point then. Okay, cool. Process and resource, we discussed that last time. I don't want to cover this because we're at the end of the time anyway. So one thing I did mention here, and that's probably something we can discuss next week, is what happens with outreach to the Antelope website. So who takes care of this? Who directs it? Will everybody receive the information if somebody requests something there? So this is something that I think makes sense to kind of discuss next week in regards of how do we handle if somebody raises interest for Antelope in general. Okay. Apart from that, any other discussion point that anybody would love to bring up for today?
No, I think it's good if we adjourn since we've lost people already.
I was actually just going to ask, I had to miss last week. Did we make any progress forward with the Explorer conversation?
Yes, the discussion was that we will, and that was the point that Eve raised. I hope I formulated the right way. So Eve would be positive to evaluate adding Block Explorer to the top 21 item list. And this led to a discussion about the list itself. So we will do a reprioritization of the top 21 items beginning 8th of September, and kind of do another voting session and see if the priorities are still the same as they used to be. And this will be a point where Block Explorer can be added to the list and might be added, and then we run into an RFP process. So I volunteered to create the executive summary for an open sourced Block Explorer for the coalition, which I will coordinate with Aaron, Eve, and Lucas, and anybody that would obviously like to participate there. And then we bring it up for vote in this reprioritization exercise.
Okay. One other thing about that, with that quarterly reevaluation, we want to, one of the things I brought up, and I think we all generally agreed on, is we want to have a comment period, a community comment period coming up to that, so that we live up to our pledge of openness. And if it's on the 8th, somebody needs to somebody or some small group or whatever needs to figure out, how are we going to take comments? How are we going to publicize the fact that we're open for comments on that next reprioritization? Basically telling the community what the current priorities are, any that we already know of that are likely to come in, and then take their be open to their comments in some way that we can evaluate as we go into making our decision as a group. Does anyone have an idea about the best way to take that on? Is that just a communications thing, or do we also need to set up, do we just set up a Google form for people to submit their feedback, or is there some other way that someone feels is better? If we don't talk about it this time, we should talk about it next time, or we should talk about it in the channels. But if we don't talk about it soon, then it's not going to be, that we're not going to have any kind of meaningful period for people to share their thoughts with us. And I think it's important that we give that.
I will add it to the agenda for next week, Douglas.
I think chains can also go about it whatever way they feel, but I fully agree with the general sentiment behind this. I think we should also make sure that any additional topics or features or things that we'd like to see potentially funded, we should come up with a list of new ideas and ask people also what they would like to see potentially funded, just to make sure that there's, if you remember originally, I think we had over 70 different items. We ended up selecting only the top 20 or something, but there's quite a few things that are not on that list that I think would be interesting to look at. So yeah, just anyone really that has any suggestion on features or various additions to the code base should be given an opportunity to voice these ideas.
Okay, added it to the agenda.
On the Block Explorer piece, just the prioritization followed by an RFP process is probably what, 3 months, 2 months from any decisions being made.
Yeah, so probably.
So I mean, I'm not trying to advocate short circuiting that process, but we do have an Explorer, and I didn't get much feedback. Eve, you weren't here. I don't know if you were here, Noam, but we parameterized it. It's basically working against every chain here we all have Hyperion, right? So it's something that I feel like I proved could be easily configurable for different chains. I mean, we're continuing to iterate on it and add improvements, and every one of you is welcome. It's open source to run it if you'd like. And I personally would like to see like a Explorer that's like the Antelope Explorer that compares with the Atom Scan Explorer that I shared when I demoed ours. I'd love to see, at least the 4 coalition chains in that sidebar and have it hosted somewhere, possibly under the Antelope domain or not. We can figure that out later, but it's there. It's mostly done. There's just some customizations that are needed for each chain, even specifically like the colors and the logos. Like I obviously didn't pick the right ones and didn't put a lot of time into it. So is there any interest, I guess, in that context of just taking what we have and not, just taking what we have and, putting a little time in from each of the other chains to get the colors right and, just take care. Like, I guess we'd have to build a power up UI instead of CPU and net and a couple of things, but is there any interest there and just taking what we have and like putting a little effort into it so we could have something before 3 months from now, considering it's already mostly working?
I guess what I said last time is I do believe, and I align with the idea that Antelope should have access to a block explorer, or that we make that available to people. My view is that the block explorer would be just a block exploration function, which is perhaps different than the Swiss Army knife that we're accustomed to with blocks or authority or whichever of the other ones. I would be okay with fast tracking that component. What I said though is that if Antelope is going to be onboarding this cost, then it's obviously not just up to me. That's why I brought up, and we started talking about how do we reprioritize priorities, which led into all right, then we should probably every couple of months revisit the priorities so that we can relay out the roadmap, update it if there are any changes and such. Again, I would be of the position that having Antelope have a block explorer, so not necessarily a Swiss Army knife, but a block explorer with a simple drop down that could point to the 4 separate coalition members right now would be of benefit. I think it would be pretty cool. If that's the case, then it actually doesn't need all of the other functions that you just mentioned. I think that would be okay. Having said that, I also recognize that then some people may feel that why is this priority getting special attention versus others? I also have a priority.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not saying funding. I'm saying like, do you guys want to have,
yes, I would support that. Yes.
Yes. And to your point, like the power up example, I only brought that up because right now in the Explorer, when you go to an account, when you go to your account, you can stake CPU and net. So it maybe in that regard, we could add a simple parameter in the config where for your chains or, for EOS, you could just have a flag that says, don't do CPU and net. It wouldn't do power up either, right? It just wouldn't have that part of the Swiss Army knife. There's probably places we could.
Yeah, until it gets built, right?
Yeah.
So see what I'm saying is, even, I guess, further away from that, I don't even see a vision where a block explorer has the power up function, because I think that's separate. I think the block explorer is really just the block explorer. You put a transaction ID and you get information from that transaction ID. You do not transfer tokens. You do not interact with the block explorer to interact with the blockchain in that sense. That is a different vision that we are heading in. Okay, so it's not a portal to the world. It is simply a block explorer.
So that's the whole usability plus conversation. I don't want to get into where that line is and where things bleed, and I mean,
so given that
my point was more like, I mean, Eve, did you see the parameterization we did, and have you seen the deployed version or no?
Yeah. It's so again, it's not that I'm against the actual iteration of the current block explorer. It's I believe a block explorer in the future will simply be the block explorer. And then if that's the case and Antelope sees value in that, let's implement a block explorer for Antelope. that has simple drop-down menu that can showcase the blocks and the information contained within blocks for each of the 4 chains. But
Right,
then
and I
it
guess
would
all I'm
not be
saying-
used to transfer tokens. It would not be used to see which block producers are there. It would not be used to vote. It would not, it's just the block explorer.
Right. So we would have to make it
Well,
appropriate for that use case. Like all I was asking is, with what we've done, it's pretty close to being something. Again, we'd have to rip out some functionality or create an alternative.
just make it so you can turn it off, that you can turn off all those things in the configuration. Can I flip the question around and say, TELOS, I understand your vision for it. And there is no one right answer. Our vision that we've been building on is that we believe that there is value in this kind of Swiss Army knife, if you want to call it that, one-stop shop, especially if it can be made, if it can have a variety of modalities. So there's a simple mode and an advanced mode or whatever, right? And even maybe more granular than that. Maybe there's a developer mode. Maybe there's a trader mode, right? Anything like that. So would anyone have since we've already done this, we've already gone pretty far down this road and we see a value in it existing, would anybody have a problem with us continuing developing this and launching something that covers all the chains with as a way to sort of demonstrate the value, see if our communities do this under some kind of Antelope umbrella, not funding, certainly not funding right now. Maybe if people find value in it, maybe we might come back and ask, or maybe we'll ask for Pomelo or something like that. But does anyone have a problem if we do that? If we say, hey, this is antelopescan.io or something.
I don't necessarily have a problem with that, where I think, and maybe you can answer this. So let's say I was on, I don't know, the gate.io, or if I'm on Binance or whatever, the transaction ID, do you foresee that then it points to Antelope Scan?
I think that would be up to you guys. And I think we're already in the conversation of usability. I mean, I tend to agree with what Aaron said, and that is that, and I think what you said, Eve, that if I click a transaction out of Gate, I should be taken to like the most friendly, welcoming place, and that's not the Block Explorer, right? It should be Unicode, right? And I agree that there's things that don't belong in the Block Explorer, but I think there's probably things that don't belong in Unicode, like deep contract interaction table and raw action interface. There's things that I should log into the Explorer and do. That's the usability conversation. I don't really necessarily want to have that. I think that, well, two things. One, each chain can decide what they tell the exchanges to do. I'd like to see a really friendly landing pad for new users that just withdrew from the exchange and now they're stepping into our ecosystems, like a wallet. If the wallet can show that transaction and get them onboarded in a friendly way to log in and start using the tokens they just withdrew. But generally, I think we got to figure out where that line is, where the sides blur and the edges overlap. That's usability. My question was purely kind of what Douglas said, is like, we have this thing. You guys are green because we just wanted to show that we can change the colors. You're like a spearmint green, I think, or maybe that was wax. But like, to go in, like a little bit of effort would be needed probably from, each chain to go in and like change the SVG or PNG files and change the CSS colors that you pick. I mean, we could work with you, but just to get those things to a point where you're happy with it. And then we would have this thing where there's 4 chains in the sidebar. We can add the test nets also. They're all there as long as there's a Hyperion endpoint. And then, to kind of what Douglas was saying, like, we're going to continue developing it and adding features. I would say that there's certain features that we probably aren't going to build like pro bono. Like, we're not going to build a power up really sophisticated UI unless you guys want to build it. You're welcome to put a Vue developer on it and do it, and it'll go right in the code base. Or, we would just probably put enough effort into parameterize disabling that And then the EOS configuration would just not have resource management turned on, and you would just not have buttons on the account page. So, that's more what I'm getting at. And like Douglas said, would you be receptive to that? Should we, because we do have it, and it's very close to being good enough, in my opinion, to just have Antelope scan and put that out there as like, hey, look, here's 4 chains, look at what they're all doing, dig through our blocks, and it's all branded for each of us. That was more what I was getting at. And then of course,
I'm not opposed to that. I'm okay with that. I am somewhat worried about whether or not that how can I put this? Whether or not we continue down the same path that we believe is maybe not as valuable for UX. If we do have Antelope scan and we recreate this idea of the Swiss Army knife, does that actually long term just continue the same usability that we have right now? I don't know. So, but no, I'm not opposed to that. If Antelope scan were to come about, and if it had this basically the same functionalities as TELOS scan. TELOS scan does right now, and it supported the separate chains, I would not be opposed to that. No.
Yeah, because I mean, you can go right now and use it on EOS. It's connected to, I think I switched to Rio's Hyperion. As long as there's a reliable Hyperion, you can log in and use it for everything, except the fact that it'll help you stake CPU and net, which you don't do. But it's fully functional. We have to change.
So I guess I just like quick question, because for example, one of the differences that we have on UX Network is that we have 2 tokens on the EOSIO token contract. We have UTX and UTX RAM. So if you were able to say, for example, support UX and add that, like allow people to see their balance, because it's most, I guess, like most other solutions that we looked at, we're only looking for 1 token on the EOSIO token contract. But for us, it would essentially be all that we need, I guess, all the difference that we need to benefit from this, and it would then become potentially a better choice than what we have, which is EOSQ. EOSQ is good, but it's not the most user friendly, I would say so.
Well, that is the expert mode block explorer.
Right. It is
the most cool, expert of expert modes.
For
developers.
Beyond my expertise in some cases.
It's pretty insane.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely possible. Just to give you a quick answer, I mean, yes, we built. It's all written in Vue, which is actually the Quasar framework, but it's all. We have a pretty solid strategy for making things customizable, where each chain has their own directory and you can write whatever code you want in there. And then any place for your example, like, you'd show the users UTX and UTX RAM. We would just have to go to the component where it shows the account screen and add another, element for the RAM, and just, it's got an easy pattern in there that's already established for other places where you just read the config and decide if you turn that on. And then your config would just turn that on and, make it configurable. It's, it should be pretty easy to add that in the code so that you guys just turn on the RAM token option and say what the symbol is or something like that, right? Shouldn't be too hard to do that. And that's kind of why we made it parameterized ourselves initially. We wanted to set the framework for that.
Only thing you need from me is basically to give you a Hyperion endpoint, and then you're able to set it up like pretty much instantly.
It's already you just haven't been there.
It's already set up.
I'll drop it.
May I propose something, because we have discussed about OBE extensively, or Block Explorer extensively last week. May I please ask to take this offline for discussions, and then we could close the meeting for today?
Yeah, sure. What I'm hearing is nobody has an objection to us building this out as Antelope Scan, supporting other chains as we can. You guys would come to us with PRs or requests, and then the thought that perhaps if in the future our vision, if the users really like what we built and it becomes useful, we would have the possibility of trying to get some retroactive funding for what we had built on spec, basically. If those things aren't, but we don't have any expectation of a guarantee of that. If that's okay with everybody, then I think we know how to keep moving on development, because we are at a bit of a crossroads of whether we're going to ramp down or ramp up, and that answer is going to be helpful for us. So, is my understanding correct for EOS and UX at least?
Yes, but you kind of threw a wrench in there that I'm not sure if
which the funding thing.
Yeah, the funding for past work. Do you mean past work as in the last year for where it is right now, or do you mean past work from now on to actually build, let's say, the support? Because I don't know what that even means in terms of funding, so I wouldn't be able to agree. And so I can also not disagree.
I'm not asking
I just
you
don't
to
even
agree.
Know what that means.
Well, it's not. It's nebulous intentionally, and if it even happened, we would bring a proposal and people would talk about it, and we would talk about what makes sense and what. I don't want us to have to waste time on that now. I just don't want. What I'd like to know is if we ever come and say, hey, people love this tool, they're using it all over. We're now that they see it, we're so glad we do it. Can we get some? Can this be something that's get some funding? That's the question that I would want to ask if people at least be open to that concept later, and not say, well, you never said, and you never even raised the topic of future funding. So,
I'm good with that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, same.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thanks. Have a great evening, everybody. Stay healthy. See you next week.
Next week.
Bye, Kirsten. That was the shortest bye-bye ever.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, have a good night, Kirsten. Take care, everybody.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Ciao.